I learned something dangerous about myself. It was just another regular day for him, or so he thought. The world around him seemed unchanged, as it had always been. Calm, predictable, and safe. He woke up at the usual time, got dressed, and grabbed a quick breakfast before heading out for work. But there was something about today that felt different, something that tugged at him in a way he couldn't fully explain. At first, the feeling was subtle, like an odd itch he couldn't quite scratch. It started with a simple thought. Why does everything feel like it's slipping out of my control? But he pushed the thought aside. Maybe it was just the stress of the work week catching up to him, or maybe it was the overwhelming tasks at hand that left him exhausted. He had been through worse before. So why should today be any different? As the day progressed, the feeling didn't fade. It lingered, intensifying with each passing hour. His mind wandered between moments of clarity and confusion. Thoughts seemed to pop into his head uninvited, unsettling thoughts that made him question himself. Had he always been this way? Was he really the person he thought he was? He couldn't shake the feeling that something deep within him was shifting. He tried to focus, tried to stay on task, but his thoughts began to spiral. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he caught himself staring at his reflection in a glass window during lunch. There was nothing unusual about the image looking back at him, but somehow it felt wrong. Like the person in the mirror wasn't quite who he thought he was. He didn't mention these feelings to anyone, not even his closest friends. How could he? It seemed so irrational, so out of place. Besides, what good would it do to share such confusing thoughts? They might think he was losing it, and that wasn't something he wanted to admit, especially to those who depended on him. By the time he got home later that evening, the discomfort in his chest had only grown. He had trouble focusing on the small tasks around the house, like folding the laundry or even making dinner. His thoughts kept pulling him back to that strange feeling. It felt like something was about to break, but he had no idea what. Sitting down in front of the TV, he absent-mindedly clicked through the channels, his mind too far away to truly pay attention to any of the shows. The news played in the background, but he couldn't even remember what it was about. It wasn't the news that kept his attention. It was the overwhelming thought that there was something inside him that needed to be understood. Something dangerous, like a buried truth he wasn't prepared to face. He spent the next few days trying to ignore the feeling, but no matter how much he distracted himself, it always returned. It was as if it was following him, creeping into his mind, waiting for the perfect moment to take hold. At work, he found himself snapping at colleagues for no real reason, his patience running thin even over the smallest issues. It wasn't like him. He had always been the calm, collected one, the one people turned to when they needed a level-headed opinion. But now, everything felt out of place. He couldn't make sense of his sudden irritability or the way his emotions seemed to get the better of him. There were moments when he caught himself in the middle of an argument, realizing that he was far angrier than the situation called for. It scared him. He wasn't used to this version of himself, the one who seemed to be slipping out of control. Late one night, unable to sleep, he decided to confront what he had been avoiding. He sat in the quiet of his living room, the only sound being the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. He thought back to his childhood, to the lessons he had learned, the values instilled in him. He remembered his parents, his teachers, his friends, all those people who had shaped who he was. But as he sifted through the memories, something didn't add up. There were pieces missing, gaps he had never noticed before. And worse, the more he thought about it, the more it felt like those gaps were things he hadn't been able, or willing, to see. Was there a part of him that he had been ignoring all this time? A side of him that had been hidden so deep that it had only started to surface now? And if so, what did that mean about him? As he sat in the dark, trying to piece together his thoughts, he realized that he was afraid of what he might find if he dug deeper, if he looked at himself honestly. But it wasn't a fear he could ignore any longer. The feeling was growing stronger, and the truth was becoming harder to hide. The days that followed were filled with unease. Each time he caught his reflection or found himself in a quiet moment of introspection, the thoughts came flooding back. He began to notice things about himself that he had never questioned before, small behaviors, habits, or even emotions that had always been a part of him, now seemed foreign, like they didn't belong. For instance, he realized how easily he could shut people out, how often he distanced himself from the ones he cared about. It wasn't something he had consciously done, but it had become a pattern. When people tried to get close, he always found a reason to pull away. A small part of him justified it, convincing himself that he just valued his independence. But the more he reflected on it, the more it felt like something darker at play. One evening, while having dinner alone, he thought about his past relationships. Friends, family, even romantic partners. There had been many, but somehow, he had always managed to keep everyone at arm's length. They'd all cared for him, but he had never allowed himself to get too close to anyone. And it wasn't because of bad experiences or past trauma, at least not that he could recall. It was more like an instinct, a deep-seated need to protect himself from something. But what was it? It wasn't just about the relationships. He noticed that he was quick to anger, even over trivial things. One time, a colleague had made a small mistake at work, and he had snapped at them. It wasn't a big deal, but in that moment his reaction felt exaggerated, like it came from somewhere deep inside. He had apologized afterward, but the lingering guilt gnawed at him. The more he thought about it, the more a troubling realization set in. He had been hiding from himself, hiding from the parts of his personality that he didn't understand or didn't want to accept, and that fear, that discomfort, had caused him to retreat into a shell. It was easier to live in denial, easier to ignore those unsettling feelings rather than confront them. But now, it was clear that he couldn't run from them any longer. This fear, this unease, began to change how he viewed his world. The things that had once been familiar to him now seemed distant, like he was living in a dream. He started to question everything, the way he interacted with others, the choices he had made, the path his life had taken. Could it be that he had been living a lie? Or had he just been lying to himself? His once quiet life was beginning to feel like it was crumbling around him. It wasn't because of any major event. It was the weight of the quiet, creeping realization that there was something inside him that he didn't fully understand. And no matter how much he tried to ignore it, it was growing, becoming more persistent with each passing day. He knew he had to confront it. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that he was just having an off week or that the stress was getting to him. This was bigger than that. This was about him, about who he really was deep down. And no amount of distractions could push it away any longer. The truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of fear and uncertainty. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he knew one thing for sure. It was something dangerous. And that was the hardest part to admit. The realization that the thing he was most afraid of wasn't external, but internal. It was a part of him, a part he had never truly faced. The days continued to pass, but the unease only grew stronger. The thoughts, the discomfort, and that nagging feeling that something was wrong refused to leave him. He tried to push it all aside, but no matter what he did, the truth seemed to always find its way back to him. It was as if the more he ignored it, the louder it became. At first, he had convinced himself that it was just a phase, something temporary that would pass with time. But as the days turned into weeks, he started to realize that he couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. The cracks in his facade were starting to show. It wasn't just the little moments of irritation or the frustration that seemed to simmer just below the surface. It was deeper than that. It was like there was a part of him that had been hiding in the shadows, and it was finally starting to step into the light. He began to notice how much he had been avoiding. Conversations that he should have had but chose not to. People he had pushed away, without even realizing it. Moments when he could have been open, but instead, he closed himself off. He had always been the type to keep things to himself, to bottle up his emotions and thoughts. It was easier that way. If he didn't let anyone in, he wouldn't have to worry about anyone getting too close. But now, he saw it for what it was, a defense mechanism. A way to protect himself from something he couldn't even put into words. He'd been hiding from the truth for so long that it had become second nature. But now, that truth was breaking through the walls he had so carefully built. It wasn't just about pushing people away. It was about something deeper. Something that he couldn't ignore any longer. He started to realize that he had been running from himself, from the parts of himself that he didn't want to face. The anger that bubbled up at the smallest things, the impatience that seemed to rise from nowhere, the way he'd shut down when things got too real. These were all signs that he had been ignoring for far too long. He couldn't remember exactly when it had started, but he could now see that his behavior had been a slow drift into something that wasn't him. He had been so focused on keeping everything under control, on appearing calm and collected on the outside, that he hadn't noticed the storm brewing on the inside. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He had been so afraid of facing the truth about himself that he had buried it all deep down, hoping it would disappear. But now, it was impossible to ignore. The turning point came one afternoon when he was sitting in his car after work, staring out the window. He had just had another argument with a coworker, this time over something so trivial that it seemed almost laughable. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, his breath shallow as he tried to calm himself down. The anger, the frustration, it was all bubbling over, and he couldn't understand why. It wasn't like him to get so worked up over nothing. That's when it hit him. For the first time, he acknowledged the truth, the anger, the distance, the isolation. It was all a way to keep people at arm's length, to keep them from seeing the real him. The truth he had been running from wasn't something external. It was something within him, something he was afraid to face. The truth was that he had been hiding from himself for so long that he didn't even recognize who he was anymore. It was a terrifying thought, but it was also a liberating one. He knew he couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. He had to face what he had been avoiding for so long. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. The hope that if he could confront his own darkness, he could begin to heal. But even as he sat there, feeling a mix of fear and relief, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still on the edge of something much bigger, something that he had no idea how to handle. He had taken the first step in acknowledging the problem, but now came the hardest part, doing something about it. For days, he struggled with how to move forward. There were moments when the weight of his realization felt too much to bear. He wanted to go back to the way things were, to bury his emotions, to ignore the signs, to keep living in the comfortable illusion that everything was fine. But he knew that wasn't an option anymore. He had to face the truth, and that meant making changes in his life. He had to confront the parts of himself that scared him the most. But how? Where would he even begin? He thought about talking to someone. A close friend, maybe. But he wasn't sure if he could put his thoughts into words. How could he explain this overwhelming feeling of fear and confusion? How could he share the part of himself that had been so carefully hidden for so long? He knew he needed help, but the thought of being vulnerable, of opening up to someone about the things he had kept locked away, terrified him. What if they judged him? What if they saw him as weak or broken? What if they couldn't understand? These thoughts consumed him. It felt easier to stay silent, to keep everything inside where it was safe, but he knew that wasn't the answer. If he didn't take the first step, he would be stuck in this cycle forever, too afraid to move forward, too afraid to face what was inside. Finally, after days of battling with himself, he made a decision. He would talk to someone. He didn't know who yet, but he would find someone he trusted. He would start there, one conversation at a time. It wouldn't be easy, and it might take a long time, but it was the only way forward. As he drove home that day, he felt a strange sense of relief. He hadn't figured everything out yet, but he had taken the first step. He had faced the truth. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was starting to take control of his life again. It wasn't going to be a smooth journey. There would be moments of doubt, moments when he wanted to give up. But he knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready to face it. And for the first time in a long time, he had hope. Hope that things could get better. Hope that he could become the person he wanted to be. The days after that realization were difficult, filled with a mixture of emotions. On one hand, he felt a sense of relief, knowing that he had finally acknowledged the truth about himself. On the other hand, there was a growing fear about what that meant for his future. It wasn't enough to simply admit that something was wrong. Now, he had to take action. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly looking at himself, with all his flaws and imperfections laid bare. It was a painful experience, but it was also necessary. He realized that he couldn't keep going through life pretending that everything was fine. The truth had been there all along, hiding beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. But facing the truth was only the first step. He needed to do something about it. He needed to figure out how to move forward, how to change the habits and behaviors that had held him back for so long. And that was where the real challenge began. He thought about seeking professional help. Maybe talking to a therapist or counselor would help him make sense of his feelings and figure out how to work through them. But there was a part of him that still felt hesitant. What if he was just making a big deal out of nothing? What if he was overthinking things? But deep down, he knew that these thoughts weren't just passing. They were a part of something bigger, something that had been simmering under the surface for years. He couldn't ignore it any longer. So he took the first step. He reached out to someone he trusted, a close friend who had always been there for him. He didn't know exactly how to start the conversation, but he knew that it was time to open up. The conversation was harder than he expected. It was difficult to put his thoughts and feelings into words, to explain the fear and uncertainty that had been weighing on him. But his friend listened without judgment, offering support and understanding. It wasn't the fix he had hoped for, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, he continued to open up to those he trusted. He talked to his family, his friends, and even sought out professional help. Each conversation was a small step forward, and although it was difficult, he felt a little lighter each time. He knew that healing wouldn't happen overnight, but he was starting to see that change was possible. The fear that had once consumed him began to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. The days continued to pass, but they were no longer as empty and monotonous as before. There was a new energy within him, a subtle shift in how he saw himself and the world around him. It wasn't as if everything was perfect. Far from it. He still struggled with the same doubts, the same fears, but there was a sense of movement now, a feeling that he was making progress, however slow it might be. He started to realize that the journey he was on wasn't just about overcoming a single moment of fear or facing one dark truth. It was about rethinking his entire approach to life, about understanding himself more deeply than he ever had before. It was like peeling back layers of a person he hadn't known existed. The further he went, the more he began to see the parts of him that had been buried, not because he didn't want them, but because he had been too scared to acknowledge them. Each day, he woke up with a sense of purpose. It wasn't the frantic, overwhelming feeling he used to get, the pressure to pretend everything was fine. Now, there was a sense of calm. He had accepted that things weren't perfect, that he wasn't perfect. But that didn't mean he had to stay stuck where he was. He could move forward, step by step, no matter how small those steps seemed. He began to put into practice what he had been learning about himself. He made a conscious effort to be more open, not just to others, but also to himself. The more he did, the more he understood that change wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't a sudden shift where everything fell into place. It was a slow, continuous process of being kinder to himself, of allowing himself to make mistakes, and not letting those mistakes define who he was. At work, the change in him was noticeable. He wasn't perfect, but he was different. He started to listen more, to approach situations with a calm that had been absent before. When things went wrong, he didn't react in anger or frustration. Instead, he took a breath, allowed himself to process the situation, and then responded. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when he fell short, but each time he learned something new, something important. The relationships in his life, too, began to shift. Slowly but surely, he allowed himself to open up. At first, it was small things, sharing a bit more about his day, about how he was feeling. But as time went on, he found himself talking about the deeper things, the fears that had held him back for so long. He realized that he had been afraid to let people in because he thought they wouldn't understand. Or worse, that they would reject him. But as he shared his truth with them, he discovered that most people weren't as judgmental as he had feared. In fact, many of them had their own struggles, their own challenges, and the vulnerability he showed only seemed to bring them closer. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when he wanted to revert to his old ways, to shut down, to avoid the discomfort that came with opening up. But those moments were fewer and further between. He learned to recognize them for what they were, old habits, trying to pull him back into a familiar yet unhelpful pattern. He acknowledged them, but he didn't let them control him anymore. Through all of this, one thing became clear. The most important relationship he had was with himself. He had spent so many years trying to be what others expected, trying to live up to ideals that weren't his own. But now, he realized that true growth and happiness came from within. It wasn't about trying to meet the expectations of others, but about being true to himself, accepting both his strengths and weaknesses, and working to be the best version of himself that he could be. One evening, as he sat quietly in his living room, reflecting on how far he had come, he realized something important. He wasn't the same person he had been when this all began. The man who had woken up that morning, unsure of who he really was now someone who understood himself better. He had confronted his fears, his insecurities, and the parts of him that had been hiding in the shadows. And although he knew there was still work to be done, he felt proud of the progress he had made. He thought about all the moments in the past when he had doubted himself, when he had felt like he was lost, with no clear direction. But now, with each new step forward, he began to see that the journey wasn't about having all the answers or being perfect. It was about showing up for himself, even when it was hard, even when the road seemed uncertain. It was about accepting his flaws, acknowledging his mistakes, and knowing that they didn't define him. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. It wasn't a perfect peace, the kind where everything is perfectly in place, but it was a contented peace, the kind that comes from knowing that, even in the midst of uncertainty, he was moving forward. He was learning to be kind to himself, to embrace the things that made him who he was, both the light and the dark. There were still challenges ahead. Of course, there would be moments of doubt, moments when he would stumble, but he now had the tools to handle those moments. He knew that growth wasn't a straight line. It was full of ups and downs, twists and turns. But that didn't scare him anymore. He knew that, no matter what happened, he was strong enough to keep going. In the end, the journey had shown him something incredibly valuable. That change wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't a quick fix, but rather a gradual process, one small step at a time. And although he hadn't reached the end of his journey, he knew that he was on the right path. As he looked out the window at the sunset, he felt a quiet sense of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he was content with who he was. He didn't have all the answers, but that was okay. He didn't need to have it all figured out. What mattered was that he was moving forward, learning and growing, and that, in itself, was enough. The road ahead would continue to be filled with challenges, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready to face whatever came next, with courage, with hope, and with the knowledge that he was capable of more than he had ever believed. He had learned something important through all of this, that the most dangerous thing we can do is hide from ourselves.
But the most freeing thing we can do is to face the truth, no matter how difficult it may be, and embrace the person we are becoming.